evening, everyone, and welcome to the Northeastern Illinois University Library. My name is Ed Remus, and I am the librarian for History, Political Science, and Justice Studies here at NEIU. This is the third event in an ongoing event series that we have here at the library titled Between Past and Future, an event series that we organize in collaboration with the History Department. And I'd like to just read for you all kind of our mandate, our description of the event series as follows. We live in polarizing times. As political leaders articulate differing visions of the future, they share one significant feature. They never fail to bring history to bear on the problems and tasks facing us in the present. Meanwhile, in the halls of the Academy, ongoing changes in our political reality motivate scholars to reinterpret the past in profound ways. So, how should history be written, and how should the world be changed? The NEIU Library's Between Past and Future series invites speakers with differing perspectives to address a broad range of topics at the intersection of these two questions. Between Past and Future public fora place NEIU students, faculty, and community members in dialogue with academics, journalists, and political figures drawn from the Chicago area and beyond to wrestle with controversial questions at the crossroads of history and politics. Questions which admit of no easy answers. And so as we are approaching the centenary of the October Revolution in 1917 in Russia, we came to a consensus that to consider differing historical, political, scholarly approaches to that history and that topic would be relevant in this moment. So I would like to thank especially our history department and Chuck Steinwedel for helping us to organize this event. In a moment, I'll introduce our speakers, and then they will each give opening presentations of about 15 minutes. They'll respond to each other, and then they'll take Q&A. Just a few words, administrative words before we get started. We're thrilled to have CAN TV here with us to record the event. They'll be recording it for later broadcast. I believe they intend to do so actually on November 7th and 8th, the proper centenary. And they'll also be posting the recording of this event on YouTube. So what that means is if you do not wish to appear in that broadcast or on that recording, please keep that in mind during the Q&A round. During the Q&A, I'll explain this at the time, but I'll invite those with questions to come up here and to pose their questions to the panel. And at that point, if you'd prefer not to appear on the recording, simply raise your hand and our intrepid library intern, Victor, will come around with an index card and a golf pencil. You can write your question down, pass it to me, and I'll pose it faithfully as it was written. We welcome questions from any and all perspectives, left, right, center, scholarly, intellectual, political, and in that spirit we've also, thanks to Victor, curated a very fine book selection here outside the room. So on your way out, feel free to browse our book display and to take one of the many books that we've offered there from differing perspectives on the history of the Russian Revolution. So now I would like to introduce our panelists. To my left, Chuck Steinwedel will be presenting on the transition from the February Revolution to the October Revolution against the backdrop of the industrialization of Russia and the breakdown of imperial authority. Chuck is professor of history and chair of the Department of History at Northeastern Illinois University, where he has taught European and Russian history since 2001. He received his BA from Carleton College, his MA from the University of Chicago, and his PhD from Columbia University. His book, Threads of Empire, Loyalty and Tsarist Authority in Bashkiria, 1552 to 1917, which I believe you can find outside, was published by Indiana University Press in May 2016. His articles have appeared in the journals The Russian Review and Ab Imperio, as well as in volumes by Princeton University Press, Rutledge, and Indiana University Press. To Chuck's left, Ilya Gerasimov will be presenting on the Russian Revolution as an imperial event and the meaning of 1917 in non-Russian areas within the Russian Empire. Ilya holds degrees from 3 graduate schools in 3 countries. Since 1999, he has been executive editor of Ab Imperio Quarterly, an international bilingual professional periodical developing the paradigm of new imperial history with a special focus on the territories and populations of the former Russian Empire and the Soviet Union. He has published 3 books and 24 articles and chapters in both English and Russian, and has edited 7 thematic collections of articles. Gerasimov is also editor of and principal contributor to the 2-volume history course, A New Imperial History of Northern Eurasia. His new forthcoming book in January is titled Plebeian Modernity, Social Practices, Illegality, and the Urban Poor in Russia, 1906 to 1916. Next, we have William A. Peltz. William will be presenting on how the Russian Revolution related to revolutions in Germany and Hungary, and on the legacies of these revolutions for the political left, and a bit by distinction for the center and the right. William is director of the Institute of Working Class History in Chicago and professor of history at Elgin Community College. His recent works include Wilhelm Liebknecht and German Social Democracy, the Eugene V. Debs Reader, Against Capitalism, the European Left on the March, and most recently, A People's History of Modern Europe. This month, he's finishing his forthcoming book, A People's History of the German Revolution. And finally, at the end, Marina Mogilner will be presenting on how 1917 was remembered in the Soviet Union from the 1920s through the 1980s. Marina is an associate professor of history and Edward and Mariana Thaden Chair in Russian and East European Intellectual History at the University of Illinois at Chicago. Since 1999, she has been a co-founder and co-editor of Ab Imperio Quarterly, Studies of New Imperial History and Nationalism in the Post-Soviet Space. She is the author of several monographs, including, most recently, Homo Imperii, A History of Physical Anthropology in Russia. Mogilner continues to explore different aspects of the politics of knowledge and of history, of ethnography and human sciences in the Russian Empire and early Soviet Union. Her current research project focuses on Russian Jewish racialized discourses and practices of the self in 19th and 20th centuries. Her most recent publications include Between Scientific and Political, Jewish Scholars and Russian Jewish Physical Anthropology in the Fin de Siècle Russian Empire, an article in the collected volume, edited volume, Going to the People, Jews and the Ethnographic Impulse. And so I've asked each of our panelists to, again, give opening remarks of about 15 minutes each. And after that, we'll have a response round during which they can respond to points raised by other panelists or engage each other in a bit of open-ended dialogue and discussion. And then after that, we'll open it up to Q&A. In the interest of our collective time and stamina, I will formally bring the event to a close by around 9:30. So about 10 minutes before that, I'll ask all of our panelists to go down the line with just some closing remarks, any points they'd like to leave us with to mull over. So with that, please join me in welcoming our panelists to Northeastern Illinois University.
I want to thank Ed for organizing us and setting up what I hope will be a good evening for everyone to explore an important issue. I also want to thank my fellow panelists for agreeing to join us, and to thank you all for coming on this lovely November night, or it seems like November. I wanted to start by setting the table, as it were. That is, I think most here are aware that there were 2 transfers of power in 1917, and I just want to sort of highlight some of the principles at stake here. The first transfer, of course, being at the end of February, when the Tsar falls, the Emperor of all Russias, Nicholas II. And the second being in October, when the Bolsheviks, under the leadership of Vladimir Lenin, seized power from the provisional government and established a socialist state. It's hard to overstate the importance of the abdication of Nicholas II in the very beginning of March in 1917. That is, this is one man leaving the throne, but it was truly a decisive moment for Russia and in many ways for the world. The Tsar's family, the Romanovs, had ruled Russia since 1613. They had ruled in an unlimited fashion until at least 1905, and in that year, or in the following year, there was created a representative institution called the State Duma, Even then, the emperor barely acknowledged the fact that he had created the Duma. That is, he tried his best to resist efforts to limit his authority in any way. So the emperor was essential and central to this political system. The soldiers and civil servants of Russia swore loyalty not to Russia, but to the emperor. For those who were being brought into the empire, either as immigrants or as the empire expanded, those who came under its sway, the key moment was the swearing of allegiance. In the region I study, it's called Bashkiria, the Bashkir elite started to swear allegiance in 1552, and so they had really sworn allegiance to this dynasty since the moment the Romanovs took over in 1613. Representations of the emperor were everywhere. They were in schools. This picture appeared in public buildings. The statements of the emperor were read out in Orthodox churches, in mosques, in Lutheran churches. That is, he was absolutely central to this political system. The sources of legitimacy for the emperor on the eve of the revolution, I think we could really count several. Four in particular I want to highlight. The first is religious. The Tsar was the patron of the Russian Orthodox Church. He saw himself as the protector of the church, and not a literal head of the church, but certainly in spirit, and identified with Orthodoxy. He was also built into other faiths that would recognize or have language recognizing his authority in the religious sphere. Militarily, the Tsars wore uniforms at least from the time of the Napoleonic Wars. Their legitimacy derived in large part from their ability to protect the empire, to expand the empire, and so this moment in 1917, the military dimension is crucial. There's a traditional element to the Tsar's rule, and especially the Tsar as the traditional head of a social hierarchy. That is, the residents of the Russian Empire were not citizens. They were subjects of the Tsar. The inequality of these citizens was written into law. That is, there were, where we at least would have the language of equal before the law, this was not the language of the Russian Empire, where distinctions could be made among different subjects of the Tsar, one of the most notable ones being the Pale of Settlement, where Jews were allowed to live and they were not allowed to live outside of that. I mean, that's something that, applied to them in particular, and there are other such examples. Socially, the nobility was the most favored stratum of the population. Their privilege was based on their service to the Tsar and his family going back often centuries. The fourth type of legitimacy, I would stress, would be the Tsar as the source of law and the guarantor of the social order. The Tsar, at least in imperial ideology, was conceived as the arbiter, an objective person who by his wealth and position stood above society, and therefore in principle could be fair and impartial and arbitrate between different elements of society. That he had, because of his position, a particular obligation to serve the welfare of his population. Now, we certainly, many did not think he was doing so before 1917, but this becomes a particular issue in 1917. So for these various reasons, we see the Emperor of all Russias, which was his official title, as having a position that's really difficult for us to imagine as residents of a nation state. So what happened in 1917? What happens to change all this? Well, I think if we look at it, we could see every element of the Tsar's legitimacy is called into question in 1917 to the point where he's forced to abdicate. Religiously, he alienates many in the Orthodox Church by his association with Rasputin, Those of you who are at all familiar with this period and perhaps either watched as young people or your kids watched Disney films, that is, there's even one on Anastasia that features Rasputin in a very interesting role. But this, in fact, he was a semi-literate holy man from Siberia. He was not trained as a priest. He had no official role in the church. But the Tsar identified, and the Empress, the Emperor and Empress identified with Rasputin as more a person of the people, a man of the people, someone who could help them, who could give them kind of spiritual guidance. And he, in doing so, sort of turns his back in a way on the Russian Orthodox Church, the formal church. And this caused many in the church to resent this deeply. That is, this was seen as an affront to the hierarchy that he was supposed to protect and defend. The military failures of the era are notable. That is, Russia had entered the First World War in August of 1914. This required a massive mobilization. The fight against the Germans and Austria-Hungary went reasonably well at times, then not so well at other times. In either case, though, it was a tremendous burden. Some 15 million men served in the armed forces during the first 3 years of the war. Nearly half were eliminated by enemy action. The Germans and Austrians took 2.4 million prisoners, wounded 2.8 million, and killed 1.8 million men. Now, pause for a moment to think about wars in our lifetime, or in even those with a little bit of gray hair in the room, that this is a tremendous loss of life. There was a sense that the Tsar was in part responsible for this war effort that was going poorly by 1917. He tended to be more comfortable around his favorites, people he knew by their high birth and their proximity to him, rather than those who were most competent. The war was simply not prosecuted very well, and this really came to undermine the legitimacy of the autocracy. The war also stressed the social hierarchy. The difference between the ordinary peasants and workers and those nobility and the elite was great, to the point that many of the ordinary people, the ordinary soldiers at the front, felt that they were fighting someone else's war. You get language as from, overheard among recruits that, maybe if we just, paid some money to the Kaiser, then this would all go away. Or why am I putting my life on the line when my officers are, back eating, 3 square meals? If I'm at home and, I'm a mother and my husband's been sent off to war, I'm taking care of a couple of kids, I'm worrying about my husband, all for what? That is, there's this real distance between ordinary Russians and the elite. There's a sense that the Tsar is not providing for the welfare of his people. That is, by the winter of 1916, 1917, the food supply was strained in Russia. The harvests weren't as bad as they might have been or had been at certain times in the past, but there was a real problem getting the right food to the right places, getting it to the front to support the troops. Doing just that strained the supply to the civilian population. By late 1916, some people had to sleep in lines overnight in order to be there in the morning when the shop opened to get even something like bread or sugar or cooking oil. On the eve of the revolution, it's calculated that women spent nearly 40 hours per week standing in line for various goods. So there was both shortage of food and a great fear. There was an announcement in February that in March there would be rationing. There was a fear that food supply would be cut even worse and more people would go hungry. So this came together toward the end of February in a set of food riots. It started largely as food riots led by women who had gathered for International Women's Day. And why do women feel this first? Well, they're the ones who are doing most of the shopping. So they're the ones that are standing in line. They're the ones that are confronted with this difficult situation. This results in a sort of cascading chaos in in St. Petersburg, or as it was named in the wartime, Petrograd. Why is it named Petrograd? Because it doesn't sound German. You don't want to sound German in 1917. The situation gets so bad that there are soldiers who are firing on civilians. There are soldiers who are firing on each other. One unit goes out to put down a demonstration, and then another unit sees them shooting and starts firing back at them. The military in the center is starting to collapse. And by February 28th, the military men go to the Tsar, the generals go to the Tsar, and they tell him that if you don't leave, if you don't abdicate, the war effort is going to fail. That is, we have to get the home front behind us, or this war is just not, we're not going to be able to survive the war. That's what convinces Nicholas to abdicate. That is, he abdicates for the good of the nation. He abdicates because Russia, in a sense, has become more important than he has, something that's difficult to imagine, say, 200 years earlier in the time of Peter the Great. So on March 2nd, the Tsar abdicates. The 304-year-old dynasty had fallen, had collapsed. Who was upset? Who was angry about this? Not anyone, particularly. It's sort of shocking in a way that the church doesn't issue a formal defense of Nicholas. The military has become convinced that, as much as they want to defeat Germany, the Tsar and his unpopularity is going to prevent this from happening. So the transition is in the matter of days. The power the monarchical power has collapsed, and it's transferred to, or there's a kind of a scramble to figure out what comes next, basically. Well, what replaced the emperor was not one institution, but really two institutions. The one is the provisional government, and the second is the Petrograd Soviet, or council. The provisional government came from members of the State Duma. They were not elected to replace the Tsar, but they took it upon themselves as the leading elements of society. They called themselves, I quote, the Provisional Committee of the Members of the State Duma for the Restoration of Order in the Capital and the Establishment of Relations with Public Organizations and Institutions. Now that trips off the tongue, doesn't it? What a branding issue. These were people that didn't really have the confidence to take authority. Why? Who gave them any authority? No one. That is, they saw themselves as provisionally, temporarily, taking authority, executive power in Russia, until a constituent assembly could be assembled, could be called, which would write a constitution, which would establish a legal basis for Russia's government. The men in this government, in the provisional government, were initially all men of education and property. So this is really the social elite. Now it changes a bit in the course of 1917, but generally this is an elite institution. The Petrograd Soviet, or Council, is different in that it's a kind of crudely democratic institution whereby different factories and soldiers' committees and peasants send people to this meeting to voice their concerns. It's a kind of almost a participatory or representative democracy, but where all these representatives are supposed to participate in the governing of Russia. It's led by radical intellectuals, moderate socialists for the most part. And they, in short, fairly quickly issue a set of orders which call for what we would consider civil liberties. Freedom of religion. That is, there's not supposed to be any more discrimination based on religion in the Russian Empire. Freedom of the press. The end of the estate order. And there really is a sense here, you get it from the documents, which some of you are reading, I realize, if you're students of mine, that there's really a sense of a new dawn for Russia, a new beginning, a new kind of freedom. And In retrospect, it's easy to see this period between February and October as kind of a, a failed transition. It didn't seem that way in February and March. It seemed like a real sense of possibility. The provisional government and the Soviet, however, have to confront a series of questions on which they don't agree within their own bodies and with each other, the Soviet with the provisional government. The first key issue is the war. What are you going to do about the war? Well, what do you do if you're basically a liberal, believe in the rule of law? What kind of country do you want to emulate? You want to emulate Great Britain and France, other great liberal democracies. So if you're in the provisional government, you say, we've got to stay in the war because we want to fight our allies. We want to carry out our commitments. If you're a more further on the left of the spectrum, well, you might not like the war, but what's the alternative? Are you going to let the German army come in and squash the revolution? No. You want many wanted what was called revolutionary defensism. That is, defend the revolution, defend the achievements of February. How do you resolve this? They really didn't. That is, the provisional government wanted to keep fighting the war. This war became gradually less and less popular as 1917 wore on. The Bolsheviks, as we'll see, believed that this war should be abandoned, essentially. They took when Lenin came to Russia in April of 1917, they thought he was crazy because he thought that the war should just be ended. This gradually became more and more popular, but it was not a question that the provisional government or the Soviet was prepared to solve on its own, at least not before October. Secondly, the question of land. Many peasants really wanted more land, and they saw either members, capitalists who owned land, but especially noble landowners, or the Tsar's family himself, as having land that should be given to them. Now, many in the provisional government even were sensitive to this, sensitive to the need for some kind of land reform. But how do you do this? If you're a liberal and you believe in private property, you can't simply, here, just take this. So they said, well, we might like we support some kind of land reform, but let's wait till the Constituent Assembly can give us a constitution and we can find a legal basis for transforming relationships in the countryside. The question of non-Russian territories. Most of them on the periphery of the empire, peoples who did not speak Russian as their first language in many cases, though even the borderlands were very diverse. But there were certainly members of the intelligentsia that really, saw this collapse of monarchical authority as a kind of opening. They wanted more autonomy. They wanted independence in some cases, depending on if, in Finland, autonomy, in Poland, independence, in Poland, independence. Ukraine fought over autonomy, independence, and various possibilities, configurations. Well, what does the provisional government, what does even the Soviets say about this? Well, yes, we need to restructure perhaps the relationship with the non-Russian peoples, but we can't just do that ourselves. We need to wait for the Constituent Assembly to give a legal basis to a new structure to Russia that will allow us to sort this out. But this was another issue that couldn't be resolved. Class differences, differences over who owned what. Many workers saw this as an opportunity to get better control over their situation. Whereas factory owners, they wanted to make money. They wanted to keep their private property. Some in the provisional government, many in the Soviet, thought that there should be some change. But you couldn't simply take private property. You couldn't simply get rid of these relationships that existed. It would take time. It would take a provisional government, a constituent assembly to create a new legal basis. So you see these key issues that really dominated political life in 1917 are not resolved in the course of 1917. So insert the Bolsheviks. A Marxist Socialist Party led by Vladimir Lenin As I said, he arrived on April 3rd, 1917. He came in a train from Switzerland that had gone through, been routed across Germany, and it's the so-called sealed train around to Finland Station, which is the railway to the north. There weren't many direct routes from Switzerland to Russia in the middle of the First World War. Well, when Lenin arrives, he says that that the war needs to end, there should be no respect for the provisional government, and that land should be given to the peasants. This is seen by even his own party as somewhat crazy, as extreme. But in the course of 1917, with the breakdown of authority, the continued chaos in Petrograd and other urban centers, this starts to seem more appealing. That is, what seemed crazy in February or early April, now by September doesn't seem so crazy. So through really organizing, especially in military units, the Bolshevik Party, under the banner of the Soviets, these workers' councils, organizes the overthrow of the provisional government in late October 1917. They fairly quickly try to create a socialist government that is, and some would argue, the first socialist government in Europe. Others might say the Paris Commune in 1870 was. But they certainly are determined to do this. They immediately issue a decree ending the death penalty in the military and releasing political prisoners. The Bolsheviks present the so-called decree on peace, that there should be an immediate peace without annexations and indemnities or financial compensation. They begin to explore this with the Germans in a very concerted way. In March of 1918, they signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, which gives up much of the west of the empire in exchange for peace. The Bolsheviks issued the Decree on Land, which authorized the seizure of land without compensation from landowners. They created a new government called the Council of People's Commissars. They banned the press that opposed them. In December, they created the Extraordinary Commission for the Struggle Against Counter-Revolution and Sabotage, better known as the CHK, or later the AGPU, then the GPU, then the NKVD, then the KGB, then the FSB. You get the idea. A later manifesto outlines the creation of a new federation of national Soviet republics, a promise that is to resolve the issues with the non-Russian population. In this federal republic, private property would be abolished. The confrontation of the Bolsheviks with their opponents, the political confrontation, comes to a head in the first days of 1918 when the Constituent Assembly at last is convoked in St. Petersburg, Petrograd. It meets for one long day and then is disbanded by the Bolshevik-dominated government, never to reconvene. Thus ended the liberal phase, really the liberal potential of the revolution. The Civil War follows where, unlike the fall of the Tsar, which few complained about after the Bolshevik seizure of power, those who were against their policies on peace in the military began to fight Bolshevik power. Those who owned factories started to organize against the Bolsheviks, and we see a civil war that would ravage Russia for the next 2.5 to 3 years. So we see that in February 1917, the emperor, the idea of monarchy had lost legitimacy and crumbled. The provisional government, with sometimes support, sometimes antagonism of the Soviet, does its best to try to keep this situation together, but then is overthrown fairly easily by the Bolsheviks in October. The Bolsheviks claim power, required no such long names like the provisional government. There was nothing transitional about them and their intentions anyway. They took power in the name of socialism and the working class, and their rule lasted for another 74 years. So with that, I want to turn it over to Dr. Gerasimov.
Thank you. I need the stick shift.
You get the stick shift.
Well, thank you for, first of all, thank you for inviting me to join your discussion series. Will it stand on its own? Yes. The main historical question of the 1917 Russian Revolution is, of course, why should anyone care about what had happened 100 years ago in another hemisphere? I mean, do you personally know someone who had a story about not the revolution, but 1917? Like in 1917, I know the guy who, in our family, who moved from Detroit to Chicago. And maybe you know, my grandfather was born in 1916, and I knew him very well, but he was an infant when the revolution happened. So all I know about 1917 revolution, I know from books and archives, of course, but from books. So how is different from knowledge about ancient Egypt? How about celebrating, say, the third millennium of the downfall of the 18th dynasty in Egypt, right? And it's not because we're in Chicago. In modern Russia, it's not very different from the American Midwest. According to the latest sociological poll taken September 14th this year, only 11% of Russians knew whom had the Bolsheviks overthrown in October 17. I mean, the democratic provisional government. Most believed it was the emperor himself. And with young people, of course, college-age folks, it's even more explicit. People, they are less concerned with history. In another survey, 72% of college-age students couldn't tell the year when World War I ended. Do you know? Just checking, yeah. So, I mean, there is, in a small TV survey in my home city of Kazan, there was a guy who believed that Joseph Stalin is a pop singer. I wish. I mean. So, and this is a normal response to the idea that history is about the ever-growing load of dates and facts that we have to keep constantly, that it has a hidden meaning and it can teach us a lesson, a ready lesson. That our lives are determined by the deeds of our predecessors. We have too much on our plate already to be concerned with people and events that we never saw in our lives personally. And of course, a different modern understanding of history began forming after World War II, which showed how historical progress can lead to human atrocities, economic devastation. So the Annales School in France, the British Marxist historiography revolutionized our profession. And I won't go, of course, into details, into professional details here, but I want to mention a single most important insight about the meaning of history from that period. It was famously captured in 1953, the year that Joseph Stalin died, finally. The idea of the famous saying by a British novelist, L.P. Hartley, the past is a foreign country, they do things differently there. I mean, Russian past is equally foreign to Midwesterners and Russians, and equally relevant as any first-hand experience on a trip to Japan or New York City can be. I mean, it's about unique events and circumstances that will never repeat, but also about people very similar to us who had to make choices under these circumstances. And the task of history writing, I think, is to translate those foreign realities into the language of our modern society and culture. Well, of course, this translation should be verified by facts. It's not just about rhetoric. And a good translation helps to unearth new facts and names and give voices to people muted by previous translations. Every generation needs to do this work from the very beginning. And this is why we need theories and concepts. They're just like dictionaries, helping us to navigate the foreign land and of the past. And one of such dictionaries is the concept of the Imperial Revolution, proposed by a Princeton historian of Iberian empires, Jeremy Edelman, who has nothing to do with studies of Russia over the 20th century. He published a book on the topic in 2006, and two years later, a seminal article that summarized his ideas already on the basis of the book that he published. And we usually expect a revolution to overthrow the old regime as a result of the movement of activists who have an alternative design for the future. So socialism instead of capitalism, nation state instead of multi-ethnic empire. And Edelman studied the course of events that had led to the revolution in Latin America in the early 19th century. And he realized that the well-known and solidly established facts fit better a different logic, which he called the Imperial Revolution. The crisis began with a major European conflict, Napoleonic Wars, and the crisis of legitimacy of the imperial governments in Spain and in Portugal. So it was the government's actions that upset the status quo within the empire, and the colonies attempted to restore the lost balance, according to Edelman. But without an effective coordinated center, a civil war broke out, and it was in this situation of civil war when secessionist scenarios became popular and national projects were developed. I probably will quote a paragraph later on from Edelman. He neatly summarized this idea. So the model of the Imperial Revolution is a productive way to translate the foreign past in terms of our social experience, just as the proletarian revolution, the idea of the model of proletarian revolution, helped to yield new understanding of the events 80 years ago, particularly in the 30s, when industrialization changed patterns and workers and proletariat was not just a hollow sociological concept to the people at the time, right? So, and I will briefly summarize 3 points how this concept actually makes it more productive to think about 1917 in Russia today. Well, first, it shows that you don't need ultra-radical revolutionaries, this vanguard party, real enemies of the state for revolution. In Edelman's study, and in 1917 Russia, it was the ruling regime that started the revolution by upsetting the status quo. Because there is a consensus among historians that in 1917 Russia, no underground group nobody took the credit for toppling the emperor in March 1917. No underground group had anything to do with it. It somehow miraculously happened by itself, like Chuck described. Just nobody were upset by the fact, right? So the regime fell basically because people stopped seeing it as legitimate, and it sounds as very sociological. I mean, any historian would read Max Weber about the concept of legitimacy, and you'll know. But it's just this intimate feeling. I believe that the guy is our commander-in-chief, and Nicholas assumed this role, the emperor assumed this role in 1915. Well, I don't feel this moral obligation to sacrifice in the name and to follow his orders. I mean, I just don't believe him. I mean, I respect the office, but I don't believe him. Sorry. Amidst the international crisis of the Great War, as in the case of Edelman, it was this turmoil of Napoleonic Wars in Europe, the regime of Nicholas II demonstrated its contempt for the people sacrificing for the war effort. Nothing terribly happened in February 1917. I mean, in Germany, this winter was way worse than in Russia. The mortality rate increased by 500,000 people, I mean, compared to previous year. There was literally nothing to eat in the cities. And in Russia, they were faring pretty well. I just several days of food shortages, but I mean, it's war. I mean, things happen. But either you want to actually be patient for these 3 days, because there were just snowstorms and railway tracks were just needed to be cleaned from snow. I mean, yes, it's winter. It's almost Midwest in Petersburg. So in the capital, and it was only in the capital. Elsewhere in the country, things were much better, and in the army, soldiers didn't know food shortages. But people didn't forgive the regime that was no longer meeting their expectations. So, I mean, it's good to have revolutionaries, but you don't need them. Second point, the revolution is about restoring this imperial revolution was about restoring the status quo, only along the new rational and just principles. Nobody had this ready idea of communism that they want to build instead of this capitalist monarchy. Few actually insisted that they need a republic instead of monarchy. The revolution didn't immediately require to split the country or to redistribute property. The original promise of the Russian Empire was to keep the authority equally alienated from everyone. And this is the invisible threads of empire. This invisible constitution of Russian Empire is very, in much details, presented, elaborated in the recently published book by Charles Steinwedel. This imperial constitution was radically offset during several decades of Nicholas II rule, who perceived Russia as if it were a nation state of Russians, treating all the rest, Poles, Ukrainians, Turkic peoples, as colonial subjects. So they were people of the first tier, I mean, and it's not just the elite, but national groups, and that often perceived as races at the time. The revolution that broke out in February-March unleashed powerful national movements, yet none of them, just as in Adelman's study, requested secession from the Commonwealth, even though some experienced other forms of discrimination under the old regime. The extreme case is Finland, which by law was part of the Russian Empire only because the Russian emperor was recognized as the sovereign of the Grand Duchy of Finland. I mean, the moment the monarchy fell in Russia, when Nicholas II abdicated in early March 1917, Finland was legally free from Russia. It was no longer part of Russian Empire. And yet, the independence of Finland was proclaimed only in December 1917, 1 month after the Bolshevik coup, and by a narrow majority vote, 100 against 88. I mean, it's pretty close call, right? Ukraine announced independence in mid-January 1918 after 1 month of open war staged by the Bolshevik regime against Ukrainian government. Everyone, for almost a year, perceived their national projects, and by national I mean not just ethnic, confessional, cultural nation, but also political nation, different forms of, literally, there was the concept of Muslim nation, national movement. The nation of Islam is a thing from 1917. I mean, when people describe in confessional terms the national project for Turkic and non-Turkic Islamic population groups in Russia, all of them developed their projects having by default not arguing pro or contra, but just having it by default, the former imperial territory as the natural arena for development of their projects, which is interesting, which makes this an imperial revolution. So secession and radical economic transformations were a response to the inability to resolve the crisis, not its cause. Revolution indeed is constructive in its immediate impetus. The 1917 revolution was about restoring the equality, only not the old imperial equality in alienation, when everyone is equally alienated from the crown, from the authority, but the new democratic equality of participation and belonging. And as Edelman argued, it was the Civil War and then radical national and economic solutions offered as individual groups tried to escape the crisis, at least on their own, if the entire system couldn't be saved any longer. And Bolsheviks just they proposed this exclusive version for a very narrow circle, a very narrowly defined group. Again, it was not a universal solution for the entire society. And third point, what is usually perceived as an epitome of revolution, its most radical representatives and ideas, is the product of its failure, and the result is civil war. The proletarian dictatorship, the nation state, the unilateral triumph of any exclusive project, ethnic, confessional, political, or class-based, is possible only through mass-scale purges of all the alien elements, whether through direct terror, deportations, social engineering. In a sense, this is an imperial counter-revolution, an attempt to dissect the intertwined multidimensional society into self-contained and internally homogeneous units. It's like recognizing the validity, say, of if there were a coordinated Latino movement or German-American movement in this country, then adding the idea of, say, territorial nation and trying to carve a Latino national state of autonomy within the United States. Sociologically, you can construct this project, but then you need deportations if there is just this level of violence, or some purges and mass-scale ethnic cleansing if things getting real bad, right? So from this point of view, these most radical things are not necessarily revolutionary. I mean, revolutionary is about really profound transformation of society. Simple solutions are not necessarily the most radical solutions. They're just simple. And the modern society is complex and hybrid, not black or white, not working class or middle class. And this was the case of the Russian Empire. It was racially, culturally, economically, and religiously complex and entangled. So the real revolutionary challenge back in 1917 and today in 2017 is to arrange diversity on the basis of some just and rational principles, to find a compromise and a common language for this. Anyone's dictatorship or the split of society into homogeneous compartments is not a solution, but a demonstration of failure, effectively a counter-revolution. So nobody had a ready solution at hand back in 1917 in Russia, as nobody have it today. And this is the only thing that we have in common with Russians 100 years ago. But at least their foreign experience helps us to formulate, certainly not the solution, but the language to discuss revolution and its more accurate models. Thank you.
Okay, first off, I would like to thank Northeastern Illinois and Edward for setting this up, the history department, the library. I think things like this are always very valuable, and I'm honored to be in such good company here. Now, I've been given a number of questions that Edward thought you'd be interested in hearing about. You probably aren't, but I'm going to try to answer them anyhow. And I'll try to be as brief as possible because I know people at a certain point, at least when I'm lecturing, sort of tune off, turn out, after too long. And if I go on and on, I always tend to bore my students. I don't think this audience is probably much different than normal students. So the first question I was asked is, how did the October Revolution become sort of conflated with the whole idea of the Russian Revolution? Why do, if you say Russian Revolution, do people immediately think of October? I think there's two reasons, well, many reasons, but two that come to mind. One is, and this is a real problem in history, is history has a real bias towards the winners. So many military historians, I'm not one, have said that Benedict Arnold was a far better general than George Washington. But you're going to hear far more about George Washington than Benedict Arnold because he was on the winning side. So I think that's one thing. They simply mattered that they won. But I think the second thing is, and we have to remember in the context, is the Bolsheviks did something the rest of the world really cared about. No, I'm not talking about socialists in the Lower East Side of New York who cared about their theory of democracy or socialism. I'm talking about the world as a whole, and that is they pulled Russia out of the war. So that horrified some of the people in some of the countries that had been allied with Russia and gratified some of the countries that have been fighting Russia. And that's something that really stuck in people's mind. So they were successful, and they did something that people paid attention to. So I think that's my short answer to that. Secondly, I was asked to sort of say, well, how does Germany or the Austro-Hungarian Empire, or by implication, the Ottoman Empire, and these other countries to the west of Russia fit in with the Russian Revolution? Well, it's my impression, and I'm not a Russian specialist by training, I don't read Russian, I read German and French only, but my impression certainly is that the Bolshevik leadership understood that good, bad, or indifferent, their revolution was doomed if they couldn't spread it. Maybe that's a good thing they didn't, maybe it's a bad thing, doesn't matter. They thought that there was no way they could survive being in an underdeveloped country surrounded by far more developed economic powers like Germany or even Japan, as they'd shown in the war of 1905-1906. So their theory was, as Lenin put it in 1918, without Germany, we're lost. In other words, they're looking for revolutions to spread elsewhere, not necessarily because of socialist belief, although that may have played a part, but because they needed someone to trade their grain for tractors. Lenin another time said, when asked what communism was, he said, it's Soviets and German tractors. Right? Which is sort of a crude way of summing up a complex idea, but I think he made the audience understand. I mean, they had this theory. They tried, for example, when Germany was starving after the Bolshevik Revolution, they tried to send trainloads of grain gratis as a favor to the German people, et cetera, et cetera. The German government, of course, turned that down because they were expecting more aid from the United States and American allies later, because the British were still blockading Germany, for months after the fighting ended. So Lenin again intervened there. So I think they really were planning on having a revolution that would spread so they would have allies. So it wasn't just a matter of some sort of idealism. It was practicality. They needed allies. They saw that if they didn't have allies, they thought they would be destroyed. Okay, the third question I was asked to comment on is, what did the Russian Revolution mean for the international left? Well, it meant different things for different people. Because first of all, left is a very broad term which includes, a variety of critical ideologies that, are against the status quo and so on. But even if you limited to socialist parties or things of that sort, the socialist movement had already been divided into pro and anti-war factions around the world. So you had that fracture to begin with. But then, with the Bolshevik Revolution, you have a further split. So even people who agreed with the Bolsheviks about being against the war didn't necessarily agree with the Bolsheviks on other things. So for example, to bring it closer to home, in the United States, the Socialist Party had officially been anti-war. They'd opposed the U.S. entry and so on. But when the Russian Revolution happened, while they welcomed Russia pulling out of the war up to a certain point, they didn't like the idea of a government that was based on councils, or a Soviet government. And one of the peculiarities of the American socialist movement was that had been propagated by a rival to the mainstream Socialist Party, something called the Socialist Labor Party had pushed for that idea, so therefore they found that offensive. But a lot of people just wouldn't accept anything other than a socialism based on parliamentary democracy. You know, the old-fashioned electoral districts based on geography, et cetera, et cetera. So what it does is, on the one hand, it inspires people. Rosa Luxemburg, leader of the German anti-war left, said the Russian Revolution was like being in a stale room and somebody's thrown open the window and at last you're getting fresh air. So, I mean, it could be very inspirational, but on the other hand, it was very divisive, because that same Rosa Luxemburg wrote incredibly critical and derogatory, if you will, things about Bolsheviks and Lenin and the Russian Revolution. She disagreed with the lack of democracy, the crackdowns on political opponents, et cetera, et cetera. And it wasn't just her alone. That was a problem. A lot of people who sympathized with the Bolsheviks in terms of being anti-war didn't necessarily agree with perhaps their idea of basing a government on councils, and often violently disagreed with the idea that you could have that sort of repression and still call yourself socialist. So it really, you know, fractionalizes an already fractured left. So for some, it will always remain an inspiration, but you know, for other people, they will often be disillusioned. So many of the people who supported the Russian Revolution at first, later on, particularly, of course, when Stalin comes in and it's apparent that the Russian Revolution is no longer what they'd hoped it was, as they hear more about what's going on, many people, you know, pull back. Many people say, well, no, we agreed with some things, but we don't agree with these others. So there's all these different dimensions to it. Now, the final thing, which is easily disposed of, was I was asked to briefly comment on the revolution's legacy for liberals and for rightists. For liberals, it was a tragedy, because for liberals, everything in history is a tragedy. It's a tragedy that then becomes evil. For rightists, it's just downright evil from the beginning, and as Winston Churchill said, that great mass killer of millions in India and various other places we could go into in another discussion, who's unjustly praised as a man of peace or something, just because he was fighting another mass murderer that we disliked even more. Anyhow, as Winston Churchill said, expressing the opinion of most rightists at the time and since, we must strangle, Winston said, the Bolshevik baby in its cradle. And on that bright note, I'll pass things over.
I have to apologize first. I have to apologize before the organizers and the audience. Have been fighting a bad cold. I lost my voice. I recovered it today, but this mic really doesn't help. So I'm afraid you can't hear me. Can you? Yes. Can you? No, I think I can, at least I can start. And then if I will collapse or my voice will, disappear, then I will ask Ilya.
We don't want to see you die on the
No, I'm not going to die. I just feel like it will be really boring if someone will just read, the notes. So let's try, and we'll see. I interpreted my task as trying to very briefly summarize how revolution has been studied and remembered in the Soviet Union, but also in this country, because I think that there were very interesting things in terms of interpreting revolution or translating the revolutionary experience that took place here. And also there are many parallels between Soviet historiography, the body of literature, historical literature about the revolution, and American historiography. And at the end, I want to say a few words about what is going on in today's Russia, in Putin's Russia, in terms of kind of rediscovering revolution as a relevant experience. But I want to start with a very simple observation that the first historians of the Russian Revolution were the participants and witnesses of this revolution. Some of them identified with the February Revolution and February regime, and many of them emigrated from those who were lucky or those who were exiled by the Bolsheviks. Emigrated from the Soviet Russia, ended up in Europe and in the US, and many of them became founders of Russian studies abroad, and in this country in particular. So this is obviously a well-known story. Others identified with the October Revolution and with the Bolshevik regime. And so these early interpretations, they continued the political confrontation that the revolution had generated. And in general, of course, this is an illusion that history is an objective science, right? So we have to be cognizant of this fact. So already in the early 1920s, Bolsheviks, those who won, realized how important it was to establish their control over the interpretation of the past and revolution in particular. History as a subject was removed, temporarily ceased to be taught in Russian schools and Soviet schools and universities, while the state and a few tolerated clubs of old revolutionaries, old exiles, initiated the project of collecting memories, collecting kind of personal accounts about a revolution. But very soon the Bolshevik party, the Bolshevik party came to realize that this kind of activity was subversive, that those memories were really diverse and coming from different people. So they established basically party control over the interpretation of the October Revolution as a foundational myth of Soviet history that legitimized the whole Soviet project. So when I teach Russian Revolution, of course I ask my poor students to read, historical sources, but I do not ask them to read historical works in order to understand the evolution of this revolutionary myth, especially in the course of the first revolutionary decade. Instead, I show them two silent films. One is a very interesting film. You can find it on YouTube, produced by famous pre-revolutionary movie director Evgeny Bauer, called Revolutionary. And this film was shot in a very brief period after the February Revolution, in early spring of 1917, when, as Chuck said, everything yet seemed possible, right? And then I show another film, quite famous, by Sergei Eisenstein, October, commissioned for the 10th anniversary of the event. And then this film in 1928 was re-edited and released internationally under the title 10 Days That Shook the World. Of course, the reference, right, to John Reed's famous book. So the main protagonist of this earlier film by Evgeny Bauer, The Revolutionary, is a representative of the Russian revolutionary intelligentsia, but not a Bolshevik. He is a socialist and populist who was arrested, who spent perhaps 10 years of his life in Siberian exile. And there is this beautiful, beautiful episode in a film when you see Siberia. It's black and white. It's really beautiful, aesthetically very interesting. So he was venerated by younger generation of Russian intelligentsia after the February Revolution took place, he comes to Moscow, he comes home, and he sees this new and free Moscow with people engaged in active political life. But in Bauer's film, you don't really see so many workers. You don't see the proletarian revolution coming. You don't feel this. What you see is basically, these generations of Russian revolutionary intelligentsia. And the idea is that the Russian Revolution, the February Revolution, is the result of the sacrificial struggle of this Russian intelligentsia, the older generation exemplified by this revolutionary and the younger generation. So this revolutionary completely identifies with the February regime, and to him the war changes its nature, its meaning for the new revolutionary Russian nation, because now this is the war that can guarantee the survival of this revolution. So he believes that the nation should go to war now to defend the February Revolution and the February regime. His son, however, he is a young student. He is influenced by the Bolsheviks. And he thinks that Russia has to withdraw from the war immediately. But because February Revolution created this possibility for the generations to reunite, the son accepts the view of his father. And the last episode of this film, we see the father and son boarding the train that will take them to the front. So this is the kind of snapshot of this revolutionary moment from early spring of 1917. And now Eisenstein's film, which gives you a very different story of the revolution. Everything that had happened before 1917 is irrelevant for the revolution. History begins in 1917. The experience of the intelligentsia, and especially non-Bolshevik socialists, is irrelevant. The real story starts with the arrival of Lenin to Petrograd in April of 1917. He assumes the leadership of the revolution, of the revolutionary movement that is already there, and the Bolshevik Party, which is presented as a well-organized party, which it never was. So they scheduled basically revolution on October 25th. The provisional government is presented as counter-revolutionary, as the government that wants to arrest Lenin, and he has to hide for some time. So the kind of central moment of this film is the episode that never took place in reality. That is a takeover of the Winter Palace, which used to be the residency of Russian Tsars, and then was a home to the provisional government. So the takeover by this Winter Palace, by literally the army of proletariat of workers, which also became a major kind of mythologized event in the Soviet version of the history of the revolution, celebrated by every generation in the Soviet Union. So this became the blueprint for the myth of the October Revolution that had survived with some modifications until the end of the Soviet Union. When Stalin solidified his power in the second part of the 1920s, the role of Lenin as the sole leader in this myth was revised to create space for Stalin as the second leader, as his only partner in the revolution, in the leadership of the Bolshevik Party. The Great Terror physically eliminated many members of the Bolshevik elite, people who took part in the events in Petrograd in October of 1917, and then were very prominent during the Civil War. And with this physical elimination, we observe the elimination of their names from this myth of the October Revolution. So their books were literally eliminated from the shelves of Soviet libraries, and even their faces were deleted from the pictures taken during the Civil War years and the revolutionary years. And remember, this was before, Photoshop. So it required some efforts. However, the main elements of the historical myth, such as the leading role of the Bolshevik Party, that kind of consciously led this revolution, the class nature of the October insurgency, with workers playing a major role, those structural elements stayed intact until the very end of the Soviet period. The emigre generation of historians of Russia were more inclined to develop the version presented in Bauer's film. So they identified more with the perspective of the February Revolution, and to them the October Revolution distorted the kind of progressive and natural development of the revolutionary Russia. But the most interesting historiographic development, something that occurred within the field of academic history, took place in this country, not in the Soviet Union. And this happened here in the 1960s and 1970s with the emergence of two schools of thought about the revolution. One school of thought can be described as a political history school, and perhaps can be best represented by Harvard historian Richard Pipes, who is also known as an important political player, right, during the Cold War years. He summarized his views of the revolution in his magisterial work published in 1990, The Russian Revolution. So basically for Pipes, revolution was an ideological phenomenon, a successful coup accomplished by ideological intelligentsia who were able to achieve such a success because Russia politically and institutionally, according to Pipes, has always been underdeveloped, inherently prone to authoritarian type of rule, and basically non-Western. So in a country that is, by its very nature, is prone to tyranny and illiberal politics, a seizure of power by an ideologically indoctrinated minority was almost inevitable. So Bolsheviks' main weapon was terror, and they established, according to Pipes, a totalitarian regime where simple people, whether workers or peasants or intelligentsia, were passive victims or active collaborations of this regime without being able to decide anything for themselves. An alternative school of thought that was formed here in this country can be described as a school of social history. Leopold Haimson, for those who know his name, of Columbia University, was perhaps the brightest representative of the first generation of this school. And these were mostly left-leaning historians who believed that social polarization in the Russian society before the First World War prepared the revolution. The first generation of the social historians studied non-Bolshevik socialist parties, trying to show how involved they were in labor politics, open to social compromise, resistant to violence, and so they were like a good kind of socialists, right? The next generation of American social historians, some of them students of Jameson, shifted their attention from political topics altogether, and instead they asked a whole different set of questions that made the history of Russian Revolution relevant again and interesting again, at least, you know, in this context. They asked questions like, for example, how workers, women, or peasants lived and experienced the revolution. Were they only passive victims of the totalitarian state, or they had their own stakes in the revolution? And in fact, perhaps there were kind of multiple revolutions, right? And some groups identified with different versions of the revolution. And also the very kind of simple question about resistance. Was there resistance on the part of suppressed groups, like national groups or classes, to this, you know, totalitarian dictatorship? So this competition and this coexistence, very problematic, I have to say, coexistence of these two schools of thought, in many ways reflected the ideological climate of the Cold War. And no wonder that, you know, this rivalry has lost its rationale, its meaning with the end of the Cold War and the collapse of the Soviet Union. And also with the kind of opening the former Soviet archives. However, these three factors taken together produced an unexpected outcome. Historians rushed into this newly opened Soviet archives, and all they wanted to find there were documents pertaining to Stalin period, Stalin era, just because we knew so little about the kind of real history behind Stalin's propaganda and so on and so forth. And this resulted in the diminishing of interest toward the revolution of 1917. In the post-Soviet Russia, a nostalgic longing for the Russia that we had lost. There was a very popular documentary produced in the early 90s under this title, Russia that we had lost, Russia that we left, you know, in the past. This nostalgia became the, you know, hegemonic discourse. Any leftist intellectual tradition or left political alternative were effectively discredited by the whole Soviet experience. And therefore, in the 90s, the revolution did not generate a lot of interest, unlike the historiography of Great Terror, collectivization, ethnic cleansing, and so on. And it is only now, with the rise of the new left movement in Putin's Russia, that the history of the Russian Revolution is acquiring a new relevance. So one might say that the lesser the better. For the decline of interest in the revolution was compensated by the rising complexity of historiographic approaches to the revolution, and I think Ilya gave a very good example of how complex the reading of the revolution may be. And of course, we have no time to discuss this now, but very briefly, revolution has been positioned squarely within the narrative of the Great War and Civil War, and recognized as a process and not as an event. And the kind of agenda-setting trends in contemporary historiography are cultural turn and modernity school. So whether, the Soviet experience and the revolution as its foundational event were part of what we understand as modernity or a kind of a deviation and so on. There are scholars who write about local or national revolutions. For example, in Ukraine, the concept of national revolution is very popular nowadays. Others remind us that the revolution of 1917 embraced anti-colonial slogans, and this was the first anti-imperial and anti-colonial revolution, and this is also something that is very relevant today. And as we approach the centenary of the revolution, we observe the resurgence of interest in this foreign event and foreign past. And I want to conclude my presentation with the most recent attempt by Russian liberal intellectuals, who are always upset about everything, right, to advance their own narrative of the revolution that would challenge Putin's politics of history. This project, which is very, very popular in Russia now, was conceived by one of the well-known Russian liberal journalists, Mikhail Zygar, who defined the objective of his project as to tell the story of Russian revolution literally in the voices of different people who experienced this revolution and who left some unmediated by historians and politicians documentary trail of narratives about their experience in the form of newspaper articles, letters, diaries, poetry, prose, and so on. So the project is called 1917, A Free History. And it started as an online project. So in the course of the whole year of 2017, a group of journalists and historians every day published accounts on what happened on this day 100 years ago. Accounts borrowed from those kind of free, unmediated sources produced by what they describe as ordinary people. We don't have to forget that not all ordinary people produce narratives. So there are always limitations, right, just based on the sources that are available. So the platform's moderators explicitly rejected conventions of professional historiography. They did not comment on their sources and did not provide any historical context for their interpretation. So they don't do what we do here in this panel. They published extracts instead of complete documents, justifying this with the fact that popular history should be interesting, and today people don't read long texts. And they did not explain why this or that particular voice has been selected and why this particular voice is representative or how representative this voice is. This year, Zygar collected the accumulated material under one cover and published as a book entitled The Empire Must Die, A History of Russian Revolution Through Personal Stories. The book annotation reads, "Chapter after chapter, through life stories of real people, the book shows how the empire was inevitably moving toward its end and why nothing could save her. The main protagonist of this book is the Russian civil society. It has been formed in the early years of the 20th century and is developing before the reader's eyes. And it disappears before the reader's eyes soon after 1917. While studying the chronicle of the 100-year-old events, the reader can understand what is happening today and have a glimpse into the future," unquote. So as you see, the book suggests an explicit analogy between the collapse of the old regime, of the civil society, and normal life in 1917, and the fate of the Putin's Russia. And the message is simple. Putin's elites should learn their historical lesson. They should not repeat the mistakes of the old pre-revolutionary elites. Otherwise, Putin's Russia is destined to collapse in the next revolution. So as I speak, this book is being translated into English, so it soon will be published under the title The Empire Must Die, Russia's Revolutionary Collapse. And I wonder how you would react to this book. So perhaps we'll have a next panel here and discuss the book. Thank you very much.
So at this point, we'll take a brief response round, and I've suggested again to the panelists that they can feel free not only to comment on each other's presentations, but also if they would like to pose a question or engage in a bit of dialogue. Meanwhile, once we get towards the end of the panel, if anyone would like to come and pose a question, you can line up right about here. And again, if anyone would like to pose a question but would rather not appear on the broadcast or recording, just put your hand up and Victor will go ahead and supply you with a card and a pencil, and then I'll read your question to the panel.
I guess the one response I have to I wouldn't doubt that for liberals everything is tragedy, but I think that I guess I hesitate to make light of I think it's easy to make light of the legacy of the revolution, not in a specific doctrinal sense, but what always strikes me is something that a poster from the 1930s aimed at business owners, which states, "Are your bathrooms breeding Bolsheviks?" Now, what's the point of that is that are you not keeping up the hygienic environment of your factory, therefore turning your workers perhaps against you, making them, resent you, and perhaps, radically anti-capitalist? And I think that, that when I first heard it, I laughed, like many of you did. But in a way, it sort of shows the way the revolution, and this was a little bit later in the 1930s, it wasn't in 1920 or 22, but I think it shows the way that the revolution sort of loomed large in a lot of minds in the West, even if in some kind of often an inchoate way, the sense that there was some sort of threat out there was some sort of alternative that, when the Soviet collapsed, as the Marxist historian Eric Hobsbawm said, the capitalists slept a little better. That is, as much as it divided and redivided the left. Would you agree that there's some sort of legacy of the revolution that I think it's not that I want to bring the Soviet Union back, far from it, but just to recognize its weight in at least the middle of the 20th century as a certain kind of alternative, a certain kind of threat to liberals in the West in a way. I don't know if anybody.
I think. Oh, you want me?
If you have a response.
Oh, no, I totally agree. I probably erred on the side of trying to be flippant. The legacy of the Soviet Union is very important, but there's two different ways of looking at it. I want to say is I don't think it survives as a legacy of a successful socialist experiment or democratic experiment. What it serves is a counterweight to the Western capitalist countries, and so it's perceived as something that's a threat. And the cartoon I like, even though I like the Scott toilet paper thing about reading Bolsheviks in your bathroom, is a cartoon I saw, I believe it was 1989 or 1990, in a radical publication called the Chicago Sun-Times. And it was a picture of a person, I think it was a man, bending down to get a drink of water, and they glance up and they see this bulletin board and it says, "Employee notices." And it says, "Because of the collapse of the Soviet Union, we're doing away with your health care benefits."
Getting bored of the
I just listening to other presentations, I thought that academics are underappreciated by neoliberal society, but very important, practically important stratum. because bloodshed starts when, as a final resort, when people can't make sense otherwise of reality. I'm not satisfied. I don't like what's going on in terms of public debates and conceptualization of revolution or just contemporary events in Russia. And the fact that people don't understand the complexity of reality that they try to, and I'm not hitting at any events in this country and realities, but still the complexity of the world we live, and we lack even the language to discuss the situation, not just formulate solutions, but the language. People don't understand that. That's why American history is so resonates so well with Russian history. Only people who know American reality, say, of the early 20th century would understand that you cannot separate class, region, and what they usually call ethnicity, but what in fact race in Europe, ethnicity, but it's actually race, and it was used as race. I mean, when you speak about agricultural laborers in the South in this country, you know that it was not just the class category, right? In the Russian Empire, is a very complex society. There were, among other complexities, say, ethnic-confessional professionalization, the specialization. There were groups that were, doing the tilling land, but also those who were associated with capitalism, with petty businessmen. It was, say, Armenians in the Caucasus or Jews in Eastern Europe. So any single clear-cut solution for class conflict immediately created new tremendous crisis in these ethnic racial relationships, and hence the civil war witnessed horrendous Jewish pogroms, ethnic cleansing in Russia, because it's exactly as part of this class conflict. And there was the major event before the Holocaust. And we, because it's easier, it's simpler, our language is compels us to discuss these problems as isolated and simple cases, but this is not how it's in reality, and this is our civic duty, first of all, as intellectuals, to develop this language. I mean, it's important to be politically active and be activists, but first of all, academics should use their brain and think well and produce and help the general public, the audience, students, and just people, next door neighbors, to provide them with the language to conceptualize this reality more accurate, and thus avoid some conflict that can be avoided. That's my point.
No, I really think that's a good point, because I think sometimes people look at things in total isolation without any historical context, and it results in them coming up with what I consider, very unsatisfactory answers to things. If I can abuse my privilege, I would like to ask you two questions. One of them is substantial, and the other is just sort of trivial. The first is, did Alexander Kerensky have a big influence over Soviet studies in the United States? And if so, how so? Because you didn't mention him. And the other is just purely a matter of curiosity. Have you seen, or do you know anything about a movie, I believe it was called Mr. West in the Land of the Bolsheviks, which I saw some years ago?
Mm-hmm. Okay, about Kerensky, who was at some point became the head of the provisional government and kind of symbolically embodied the February regime, who ended up in the US. In terms of his influence on historiography, and I wonder what do you guys think about this? I don't think that his influence was strong enough I think that he was much more influential within the Russian emigre milieu. He published in Russian language emigre journals. He was recognized there. His influence upon historians in this country was not really strong. And as for this film, which is another excellent film that I show my students and they all love it. It's fun. It's a Soviet Western. And it tells the story of American cowboy who comes to Soviet Russia as a security guard to a millionaire who comes in the 20s to the new economic policy, the post-world communism, the concessions that were made by the Lenin government to peasants and small business. So he comes to this new economic policies, Soviet Russia, and it's basically very funny Western that has really little to do with the realities of life during this time period, except it was shot in Moscow, in real Moscow of the 20s. But the very story of why this movie was produced is very interesting because, again, the party ideologues, on the one hand, they wanted to use movie industry as a propaganda tool, and they knew very early on that this is a very effective propaganda tool. On the other hand, they wanted the Soviet films to be commercially successful because they needed, some revenue. So this was a kind of a NEP film, new economic policy film, a compromise, an attempt to use what they perceived as a commercially successful form, the Western, American Western, and adopt this Western to Soviet realities. There are really very disturbing episodes in this film, very ideological. So, the ideological message at the end is very clear. But in general, of course, this is a fun movie, and I invite everyone to watch at some point. I can't remember now the letter. Mr. Мест в стране большевиков, yes. Yeah, Mr. Мест в стране большевиков, yeah.
So again, at this point, those with questions could line up here and speak into the microphone. Ideally, go ahead and ask your question, and I'll repeat it just into the microphone.
Just to know, we know that Marx was not really optimistic about Russian revolution in the future. He believed that Russia would be the last country to have a proletarian revolution. Ironically, we had it the first. So what was wrong with Marx? What was wrong with Russians? How did we end up with this revolution?
Yeah, so for the sake of the recording, I think the question is basically that Marx did not predict the first revolutionary outbreak in Russia and saw Russia more as a backwater, that it would come to Russia last, but instead, historically, Russia was the weakest link in the chain. And so what do we make of this, and what does it say about Marx?
Take it, or you want to take it?
Well, I feel that
No, nobody knew that it was proletarian revolution when it happened. And then it was cast as proletarian. Marx was dead and couldn't protest.
But this was the point of contestation. This was one of the points of disagreement between non-Bolsheviks, socialists like Mensheviks, who did exercise a very strong influence on American historiography in this country, because they were like Orthodox Marxists, and they believed that, Russia was not ready for a proletarian revolution, and Bolsheviks who modified Marxism, who were much more creative, and they kind of developed their own interpretation, which became standard, that the weakest chain can be the first one. Yes.
many who opposed the revolution, socialists, Mensheviks who opposed the revolution, said that it was premature, and what would happen if power was seized prematurely, there would be civil war and violence and chaos, and that's sort of what happened. I mean, another way of interpreting this is this sort of the idea of the weak link. I mean, that there was a particular difference in the development of Russia with a very influential large working class in certain cities and certain places that happened to be near the centers of power. So even though, and especially if you read Pipes, the working class is very small, so it couldn't be the bearer of the revolution. Well, if the workers are concentrated where political authority, military power, and communications are concentrated, then maybe there is a possibility, that this is what brought the revolution, even though, it was supposed to happen in Germany, or that he saw it as more fertile ground.
I guess we could take, once again, if you want to just speak from there, and I'll go ahead and recap the question.
Yeah, so you mentioned about the Great Terror initiated by Stalin. So did Stalin, for example, did he still adhere to Marxist ideology? So, for example, when Stalin initiated the Great Terror, was he thinking about the French Revolution, where a Great Terror occurred, or did Stalin, by his time, he didn't even think about ideology, he just cared about power?
Great. So the question is with respect to the Great Terror and Stalin. Did Stalin see the Great Terror in terms of replaying, in some sense, the French Revolutionary history, or did that not really apply in his mind to what he was doing by that point?
This is certainly one of the highly contested topics, particularly because we still lack quality studies of the period. But the rhetoric is very much of the wartime security state. It's about treason. It's about high treason. I mean, all the high-profile victims are charged with insane things, literally digging a tunnel to Japan or just selling the top secrets to the German general staff. So no, it's not French terror. It's about mobilized state under siege and the unity. And although there is probably there can be no single explanation for Great Terror, but functionally, technically, we can find rationality in this campaign only if we acknowledge that there is no modern state. No, I mean, it looks like the omnipresent is terror machine and modern government, but the very idea of modern government is about executing control over society through invisible, usually almost invisible mechanism. It's certainly discourses, but also law. It's like a computer program that runs in your computer. You almost don't see it, only when it freezes and hangs, then you see, I need to restart. So, but when you say what's Great Terror, it's been pretty terrorist regime all the time, but over several years in late 30s, they purged 40,000 men from the military. I mean, on the eve of the World War, you just decapitate military. It's insane, right? You imprison very few bright engineers that you have in this pretty poor country. And it's not, of course, about elite. The majority of victims were just common folks. They're just more visible, the elite. But this can be, and obviously there was some rationale for Stalin and for Stalin's elite, but it could work only if they didn't have any other mechanism. they could govern only through terror, using just spending this scarce human capital, but because of the lack of any other means to mobilize people who wouldn't mobilize otherwise. This tells a lot about the nature of the Soviet state, both the state and Soviet society, and also explains why probably the example of French Revolution that was so important in the rhetoric, Russian revolutionary rhetoric before 1917 through 17 in aftermath, was very toned down in the 30s. Revolution is about genuine mobilization and solidarity. And Stalin's regime in the 30s, of course, is about atomized society when you die tomorrow, you die today, I'll die tomorrow, and if I survive you, I'm the winner, and the winner takes it all. So it's a very troubled, atomized, and profoundly, in this sense, counter-revolutionary society, with a strong cult of revolution and revolutionaries, of course.
Just a very brief comment on that. If you keep in mind the international context, which we talked a bit about in the revolutionary era, but then also think of the 1930s. Think of the possibilities of, mobilizing a population in fear when literally Hitler's, just a short train ride away in Berlin, that there's that kind of a threat. If you put that kind of threat in the context of our own time, a much more secure U.S., but still, after 9/11, there's a real concern of, a fear of that's sometimes directed at real enemies and sometimes at ones that are sort of don't seem as important. But there's really, I think that international context really has to be kept in mind in the 30s, that there was really a sense that the regime was, however irrationally, but as Ilya says, why purge military men on the eve of what you think is going to be a great war, but also a desire to have a kind of purity and solidarity in the face of, the fear of the Nazi threat.
Great, and I'm wondering if we could just briefly bring you in, Bill, in terms of these questions, because I think it's very unsurprising in a way that the first two questions, thinking about 1917, have been about Marx and Stalin, right? And there's this question of, was Lenin faithful to Marx, and did Lenin lead inevitably to Stalin? And I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit to your scholarship that has kind of inhabited the mentality of Rosa Luxemburg on these questions, because it strikes me that in particular there's this question of the organized proletariat in the Soviets that Marx would have recognized as likely in some way consistent with the Paris Commune and as something kind of remarkable, and arguably as something no less democratic, perhaps more democratic than the kind of parliamentary democracy. And it seems from what your presentation laid out that Luxemburg would have understood this as well, and would have seen kind of the later elimination of that in the context of Stalinism, the way that that becomes integrated into the party and into the state, as opposed to a kind of independent civil society formation, that would have been recognized as a definite change even from Lenin. So I'm wondering if you could comment on that a little bit as, Lenin between Marx and Stalin.
Yeah, I think we have to make a distinction between people who are sincere revolutionaries in the sense that they really want to transform, they have some sort of real clear goal, which I think Lenin did. I think he was wrong on many things, but that's a different story. I think there was a certain sincerity there. And people who are more consumed with their own personal power, which I think was the question of Stalin. So Luxemburg always said that Lenin was a sincere revolutionary, but she listed chapter and verse of all the things he thought was wrong that Lenin did. For example, from the very beginning, she thought his idea of a vanguard party was profoundly un-Marxist and profoundly undemocratic. She disagreed with that completely. As she famously said in one of her essays criticizing Lenin, freedom is always the freedom for people who think differently. So she had certain principal disagreements. But I think we still have to separate Lenin from Stalin. Right? Because Lenin, in his own way, with his own theory and his own developments, was trying to make a significant change, where Stalin, I think, much more was purely thinking of how he could retain power. So, for example, I think Lenin and Trotsky, for example, sincerely wanted to spread the revolution, not just for their own personal gain, and not just for Russia's gain, but because they believed in that. Stalin, on the other hand, turns the Comintern, the Communist International, and the foreign communist parties into nothing more than sub-offices of Russian foreign policy. And that's why they have to maintain all this radical revolutionary rhetoric, because you want to be able to have the French Communist Party fill the streets of Paris if the French government does something that's hostile to the Soviet Union. But he's not thinking about wanting the French Communist Party to lead a workers' revolution or any sort of peasant and workers' revolution. He wants the French Communist Party to be loyal. That's what's important as an instrument of Soviet foreign policy. And I think Lenin and Trotsky, for whatever flaws they had, which we could go on at another time, I think they sincerely believed in one way or another in world revolution, which I don't think Stalin believed. Now I'll just use Germany and then I'll finish this point, is, for example, when Trotsky and Lenin were saying we have to have a revolution in Germany, Stalin said there will never be a German revolution because the Germans are too obedient of people. Right? I mean, so he not only said there wouldn't be a German revolution, which was wrong, it broke out a few months after he said that, but he said it based on what I'd consider racist grounds.
I'm Ed Stewart. I'm a professor of economics, and I had the very good fortune, as my colleague Andy knows, that a former president of Northeastern sent me to Siberia in the 1990s. And I'm returning the favor by taking students in March to Helsinki and Moscow and St. Petersburg. I won't get to take them back to my second home in Yekaterinburg, but I'd like to take them to at least two of my favorite cities in the world. And I'd like to ask Marina a practical question. My students, when I bring them to Moscow and St. Petersburg, what are they going to find in terms of the mentality of Russian students in Moscow and St. Petersburg in the age of Putin and illiberal democracy? What are my students likely to encounter in terms of questions and opinions and just dialogue?
An easy question, no problem.
Well, I don't really have a ready answer. First, it will depend on who is your partner institution. Russia nowadays is a class society. And Russia also is a society where you find many, segregated spaces. Like, for example, there is High School of Economics. If this is your partner institution, you will encounter students, most of whom speak English, participate in international exchanges and programs. I think your students will enjoy meeting them. You may end up meeting, it really depends on the context. Russia always was and remains a very diverse society. So there are many young people who are indoctrinated, who are anti-American, and this anti-Americanism reinforced by this new wave of anti-gay and anti-lesbian propaganda and propaganda of Russian values has been different from, Western values and blah, blah, blah. Has strong influence, but there are many who are just normal people, and it really depends on the situation. Sometimes there is a situation when they speak in the voice of the official discourse, and there are other situations in a pub, somewhere in an informal environment, where they are, very open. And also, it's very interesting to observe this society. It's very different from the Soviet society, which was indeed a closed society. These young people, they travel abroad, they speak languages, they spend their time on internet just like, we do. So in a sense, they are global people. So it's maybe an interesting task for your students to try to figure out what happens, how this kind of context changes, and when these young people change the mode of communication. So, but really, I don't have a ready answer to this question. We just spent, a month with Chuck in St. Petersburg this summer, and what was your impression from?
I spent a lot of time in the archives, not a lot of time, and but the one thing I would say that might help a little bit is I have always felt when I've gone to Russia as though Russians don't hold themselves responsible for what their government does, or they don't have that kind of association, and in many cases they also see that, they assume that of an American they meet. So I very, very rarely, and in the 90s I was there a lot, not quite to Ekaterinburg, but in Ufa, and it was very, very rare that I got the kind of hostility as an American. I mean, it was a different time, granted, the 90s it was more open to the West. But I think that's always sort of, I felt kind of worked to, this sort of mutual sense that, the average Russian isn't responsible for Vladimir Putin the way the average, American isn't responsible for whoever our president is at a given time. And
but the current president, I have to say, very popular in Russia.
Is more popular than you would think.
Yeah. This summer in St. Petersburg, whenever I would take an Uber, and the driver would start talking to me, and realizing that I came from the US and I'm heading to the archive, they would immediately switch to, discussing Trump and how great he is and blah, 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 and why I kind of responded skeptically to this enthusiasm, more questions followed. And by the end of our ride, and Chuck knows that this archive that we worked in is very far away from the downtown, so it takes like 25 minutes to get there from the downtown Petersburg. So by the end of our ride, the driver would tell me that, what, Putin regime is actually bad. He is not such a great guy, and I have many reasons to, protest, even because this is not a political protest, this is anti-corruption protest, just as you said. So I felt like I can be really arrested on the grounds of extremist propaganda. There is this new law in Russia now, and so you should tell your students not to to do this. But anyway, so you talk to people, and when they feel like more comfortable, they really stop being as ideological and become just more open to dialogue. And Yekaterinburg is known for active protests, and compared to other places, yes. So it's actually such a great tour in Helsinki. My favorite part of the former Russian Empire. So yes, I would like to go with your class.
I'm glad that somebody mentioned Trotsky. I see out there that there's at least one book of his writings, possibly others, and I hope that others of you might comment on his role and that of his co-thinkers and followers for the fight for democracy within the party while still preserving the class gains, because I'm still quite inspired by what this relatively newly organized working class was able to achieve in that period. And I wonder if it's so much the failure of the ideas that moved the revolution rather than the isolation and lack of material means to meet the challenges that were so desperate at the time. And finally, related to that, applied to today, which is some of what you began to talk about, it seems to me that given the enormous wealth in the world today, internationally, and yet the growing inequality that we see, especially in this country and elsewhere, that there is the possibility of being able to provide for everyone according to their need from those that have more than an excess, and to be able to do it and preserve democracy and have that kind of system that the Bolsheviks and everyone that followed them envisioned without having what happened in the Soviet Union happen. So I know that's a three-part question. I want to also really put in a plug for the movie Reds, which I think is a fantastic dramatization, basically around the period of John Reed, who wrote 10 Days That Shook the World, and who covered it from the standpoint of the American left being involved and interacting with the revolution at the time, which was pretty exciting. Thank you.
One brief comment on Reds. I saw it as I was learning Russian, and I swore that if he knew Russian by the time he got off the train in Petrograd, I was going to leave the theater, because it was a lot harder than that. So I think it's an excellent movie, though it's Hollywood. I mean, I would still say that, you know, it still is very much formulated in that way. I mean, as far as Trotsky, I don't know, did you want to, Bill, did you have thoughts on Trotsky?
Comment about Trotsky. Yeah, I think Trotsky was very sincere, and I think that the problem was that the material conditions weren't there. The material conditions weren't there. Once Russia is isolated, I don't think it's possible for any of Trotsky's fine ideas about workers' democracy or anything else. I don't think they could be realized in those conditions. I think it's as simple as that. I'm sort of a materialist. I tend to think the material conditions actually are much more than who has good ideas. I think Trotsky had a lot of great ideas, but he unfortunately had them in a context where they couldn't be realized.
I have just a small comment. I mean, Trotsky, especially because he was the fallen revolutionary and a victim of Stalin, gained much sympathy at the later part of his life. I'm a bit suspicious about the democratic potential of a guy who arranged proletarian revolution on his birthday. I mean, yes, I know, but he was instrumental. I mean, he was the architect of the October Revolution, of course. And Lenin was not there, other guys objected, and it was his almost unilateral initiative. And I mean, for truly class event, it shouldn't be on the birthday of its architect, I believe.
Let me just...
Yeah, sure.
I just wanted to make one response. The other thing about Trotsky that I find impressive is that he'd been leader of the Petrograd Soviet, that he actually had a position where he was, you know, more or less, in a rough sense, democratically elected, where people like Stalin had never really been elected by anything that we'd consider a, you know, democratic constituency.
I'm going to go back to the revolution. And in February, we see that it's a people's revolution, and then by October, it changes to something else. If Lenin did not come forward and kind of take control of that revolution based on this new history that we look at it as a social instead of a political aspect, do you think it was inevitable for another political person to become dominant of the revolution? Or do you think if the people had a little bit more time, do you think that they were able to organize amongst themselves to maybe get a more of a democratic type of government? Since, you know, they say that Lenin was there at the right time. Maybe if Lenin wasn't there, what would you think would have happened in Russia with its complex society?
Yeah, so just to recap the question is, had Lenin and the Bolsheviks not taken a leading role in the October Revolution, what would have happened? And would there have been another similar revolution or not? And would the results of that have been more or less or equally democratic as in terms of compared to the outcome of the October Revolution?
The one thing I'd say on that, I think I'm of several different minds on that, but the one, because I think it's an interesting and a really very difficult to answer question, but I think, again, I'd come back to the context in which the revolution occurred. That is how, I mean, I think the revolution raises the question, how can you establish democratic institutions, liberal democratic institutions, in a moment of chaos and war of the extreme that Russia saw? And so as much as I'd be sympathetic to that aim, and it certainly, I think the revolution would have looked different if Lenin and Trotsky hadn't been there, I don't know what the potential was in the moment of such deprivation, such violence. I mean, you had literally millions of men who had spent several years learning how to kill other men. And, you know, I think we see in much of Eastern Europe, in German, you know, and sort of all of Eastern and Central Europe, this sense of, you know, a recourse to arms, the Freikorps in Germany, the fascists really come out of this sort of milieu. And so, I mean, I think it would have looked different, but I guess I'm a little pessimistic how different that it would have, that the revolution would have looked, that it wouldn't have been taken over by some other actor, historical actor, who was able to mobilize basically men with guns, as Lenin and especially Trotsky did in creating the Red Army.
The way I look at the situation is, you know, that we're conditioned by Hollywood to look for a happy ending. And if there's not a happy ending, it's because the character made a morally incorrect choice. I don't think history always works that way, and I think the Russian Revolution is a classic example of that. I think that you couldn't get around the issue of the war, and you only had one or two choices, really. Trotsky's whole theory of neither war nor peace didn't work out very well in the long run. I mean, you either stay in the war or you pull out. So the first revolution says, we're going to stay in the war because we don't want to betray our allies, and we want their economic help and guidance and so on. Okay, fair enough. They tried that. The Russian army, the Russian people, couldn't stomach that, right? Couldn't work. So then the Bolsheviks come in and they try the second option. They just pull out of the war. Well, that doesn't work out so well either. So I really wonder if the Bolsheviks hadn't been there, maybe it'd been Kornilov, maybe it would have been some puppet of the French, maybe it would have been some other left-wing group that was able to mobilize workers.
Or just collapse.
Or just collapse. Just collapse. To give you a good example about the collapse theory, since you brought that up, look at the Ottoman Empire. Right? There was nothing, look at the Austro-Hungarian Empire. There was absolutely nothing written in stone or any of the sacred texts of Western religion that said the Russian Empire had to survive in a changed form with a changed government. It could have just broken completely into its constituent parts.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't know. No, I either have more questions or we run out of time. Okay. Okay, Victor?
Yes, in Steinberg's Voices of Revolution, the Kornilov mutiny was a fundamental event that really changed the tide in favor of the Bolsheviks. So my question would be, can you please provide me the historiography of the Kornilov mutiny in Western scholarship?
Okay, the question is about the historiography of the Kornilov mutiny in Western scholarship.
We can resolve this over email, I think. It's a very technical question.
Yeah, I mean, the basic contours of the Kornilov revolt, I mean, there's still uncertainty as to whether, you know, there's this moment when Kerensky is in power, there's a threat to his authority, and he seemed to call on a General Kornilov to defend Petrograd, but then when there's some uncertainty if Kornilov was really summoned to do so, if he independently wanted to rescue the provisional government. More than that, I guess I would struggle to say. That is, I think it depends on what you think of of Kerensky. If you think that the provisional government really had some possibilities and that this was sort of a rational move to call a military man, if you would see, on the contrary, that there really wasn't much to save by July in the provisional government, then this is just trying to lean on a strong man to try to prop up an otherwise failing regime. So, anybody else want to?
We'll have to take that.
Yeah, we have a number of questions, and I want to make sure everyone gets a chance. So if those asking questions wouldn't mind coming up here, and we'll just take a few at a time. Again, you can raise your hand if you'd rather put it on a card, but if you could just kind of line up here, we'll take a few at a time, and then I'll give our panelists an opportunity to make some closing remarks in which they can address some of the questions and perhaps give a bit of a closing statement. So please try to keep your remarks or questions to about 30 seconds or less. I want to make sure to get everyone able to talk.
I have a historiographical question regarding how did continental European intellectuals from the 60s and on deal with the Russian Revolution? Because you mentioned the American side of things. How did continental Europeans understand the Russian Revolution?
I guess, yeah, my question, to shorten it, is about there were a few comments made earlier about the inherent goodness or positivity in revolutions and their impetus. And my question concerning that is that revolutions in general come from a place of antagonism and negativity. That is a military failure, an environmental failure, an economic failure, a social failure, a religious failure, or a combination of those factors. Revolutions coming from that place are often muddled in a lot of contradiction and hypocrisy, whether that's the Russian Revolution or the fall of Imperial China to Mao, the French Revolution with the Robespierre kangaroo courts, executions, and also even the United States Revolution with the Sons of Liberty actually engaging in a lot of violent terrorism and repression of newspaper publishers, business owners, even their neighbors. Is there really an inherent goodness to revolution, or is it really more of a matter of chance?
Yeah, when you said that there was the left fractured after the Russian Revolution, it was more than just being fractured. I mean, the German social democracy not only fractured, they managed to kill Luxembourg and Liebknecht. So it was more than just a simple little disagreement. And for the next several years, they played a very bad, in my opinion, a bad role in German politics. And the question I want to ask is, if the revolution was made by a few thousand Bolsheviks and they were so isolated, how in a period of 3 years did they raise armies of millions and fought across that entire huge mass of land and fought the landowners, the property owners, the remnants of the Tsarist army, not only fought them but beat them. So that to me is more of a sign of the popularity of the revolution than any vote of the Constituent Assembly.
Yeah, I wanted to know a little bit more about what Marina was alluding to about the parallels between what's going on in Russia now and that Putin should learn the lessons from what was going on that collapsed the Imperial Russia. I'd like to, like if you can expand on it.
Okay, so just to quickly recap the questions in reverse order, if the panelists could expand on the point with respect to the analogy of the Tsar and Putin, the question of if the Bolsheviks were so isolated, if October is being portrayed as a coup d'etat, how did they mobilize so many people and for so long and to do such strenuous things? The question of revolutions as symptoms of crisis kind of leading to authoritarianism, and are they a matter of chance, or is there a kind of inherent goodness in modern revolutions? And then first we had the question about continental historians and what does the continental European historiography of the Russian Revolution in the 20th century look like? So that's a lot on the table, but I think maybe we'll use this now as an opportunity for the panelists to give their closing remarks. And I would ask you if you could, probably you have some sense of which of those questions would be potentially addressed to you. So if you could make some comment on that, and then also wrap in some concluding remarks.
Yeah, if it's okay, I might start with our guests first. Start on that end.
Okay, if I have some more voice left, I'll try to give very brief answers about the parallels. So basically, what Vigor, who created this revolutionary project, mean means by drawing direct analogies between pre-revolutionary regime and Putin's regime is this authoritarian tendency, the tendency to ignore representative institutions, to ignore, parliament and elections, this and civil society. So to him, those are key elements, and he is a liberal, so he does not really, when he says ordinary people, he means mostly members of the educated society, so those who participated in this political sphere, in party politics. So to him, the parallels are obvious because, Putin's regime is repeating the same mistakes as Nicholas II and his regime. So this is his answer to this question. And perhaps I can say a few words about continental intellectuals. There are a few new monographs being recently produced on the kind of a love story of European intellectuals with the Soviet Union. So compared to US intellectuals, there were much more Europeans who traveled to the Soviet Union, who were ready to close their eyes on what was already known about Stalinist atrocities. And in general, continental left in many ways was different, was more radical from, I think, the left in this country. But what I want to say, and this is something that I think goes back to this question about Trotsky and the relevance of Trotsky. I think that this is not necessarily about Trotsky, but this is about the relevance of left intellectual tradition, of left critique, which in my view is absolutely necessary. That the function of this kind of left critique is to examine and undermine the kind of established status quo. So to me, this is not so much about Trotsky as about the legacy and the continuation and perhaps development of this leftist tradition. And so here, of course, Trotsky, perhaps he is one of the most popular, but perhaps not the most influential today. So I would kind of differentiate this to planes of discussion of his role and his legacy.
So many questions, so little time. I'll focus on the thing that I think was directed more to me about the left fracturing because of the October Revolution. What I should probably explain is I think that the pre-European and, in fact, international left had a concept that you should have a socialist party that represented the entire working class, that represented the entire progressive movement. And that's something that falls apart during the war, and then, of course, falls apart further with splits over the October Revolution. And what it reveals is that within this big host of one big happy family, one big house with many rooms, as people talk about parties today, you actually had irreconcilable differences. So you're absolutely right. The Social Democrats didn't just kill Karl Liebknecht and Rosa Luxemburg. They killed hundreds and thousands of people, did all sorts of horrible crimes. They're the ones, in fact, that had a choice. They could have set up a new German army based on German people or even their own Social Democratic Party members. Instead, they went to the officer corps and recruited them and paid them for the Freikorps, which are the forerunners of the Nazis, as all the scholars agree. So these people had been having dinner with the same people they killed only, a few years before. So those splits came out, and it comes out in the tension of the war. I don't think the war causes it. I think the war reveals it. I think the Russian Revolution doesn't cause it, but I think it reveals those splits that already were there. right? And if you want an American analogy, think of the Democratic Party under Franklin Roosevelt. It's the Ku Klux Klan in the South, and it's left-wing unions in the North, right? Held together just based on huddling together for warmth.
Getting back to the question about the goodness of the revolution, I want to reiterate that revolution is not a real thing. It's just the way that we describe life. Life is our work, family, murder, and mass murder during the revolution and its aftermath. I mean, we are trying to make sense of this reality, and this is one of the ways. Some events are better conceptualized using the model, this or another model of revolution. Others do not. So is it, there is no particular goodness in a particular language. There are polyglots who prefer French over German, but those of us who speak just one or two foreign languages, I mean, we cannot see particular goodnesses in one or another. We just use them for practical purposes. So revolution is, it happens. As things happen, and we have to make sense of them. And one of the tools at our disposal is revolution. And the more subtle this model, the more sense it makes. Whether the Russian Revolution was stronger, the Bolshevik regime was more revolutionary and stronger than its opponents, it's part of a different story where we use another model of civil war. And the logic of situation that explains how you actually mobilize masses for war. But it's not a long story that we don't have time now to touch.
On the question of the goodness of revolution, I don't think, I don't know, I think the moral sort of considerations of goodness, and I would agree, don't really work very well in the context of revolution. I mean, they generally do come out of difficult places. That is, if people have other options for change, they're almost always easier and better in the sense of they're less traumatic for those involved. And so I think it really was, in this particular revolution, came out of a very difficult place in the era of the First World War. I think the one thing you could say is that, if we look at what happened in, the collapse of the Soviet Union, I mean, if you consider that a revolution, I mean, that was relatively, it was very difficult. There was a lot of economic hardship. But it didn't lead to immediately, anyway, the level of, death that we saw in the Civil War in the earlier period. So, I think it's not that, I'm going to claim that one revolution is good and the other isn't. They're always difficult, and they often, like you say, come out of a very difficult place of stress. But some, have more higher body counts than others, perhaps, as you could think of it. I think on the question of why the revolution was successful, I think, I don't know if it's a question of popularity, but I think that you're onto something in that I think the Bolsheviks identify with this revolutionary process in a way that no other party did. That is, they, this was the revolution they wanted, or October was, and they were perfectly happy to follow it through to whatever ends they could take it to. And I think that made them different from other parties at the time. And I think their success in the Civil War, I guess I don't think of it in terms of popularity in this kind of wartime, but I think, there is a point that at the end of the day, as much as, workers or peasants resented the Bolsheviks and continued, increasingly did so as the Civil War went on. I think one thing the Bolsheviks had going for them was that they, the peasants and workers knew that if the revolution failed, that is, the Bolshevik version of revolution failed, who was going to come back? Probably the landowners, the factory owners, and they weren't going to be very happy. And so I think that did, in a way, I don't know if we want to call that popularity, because I think of popularity as sort of an embrace of, an alternative. And in some cases, it was, the Bolsheviks were the least bad of several options for certain groups. I think the other thing is simply they were really, you'd have to say brilliant institution builders. I mean, they took over a system in collapse and created a government, created a 5 million person Red Army, which was largely Trotsky's doing, and, you know, created the Cheka, which, you know, came to be, as I suggested, associated with the political police and repression. Initially, it was in large part to fight speculation, to, you know, make the economy work. And, you know, we can disagree, and I certainly don't approve of the ends of the Cheka, but I mean, you have to kind of see this as a successful period, you know, effort at revolution building, and I think that's one thing the Bolsheviks were really good at.
So I'll close with just a few comments. If you have any further questions, I think the panelists might be willing to stick around and chat with you for a few minutes if there's anything you'd like to follow up on. If you'd like some reading material on anything discussed today, again, we do have a book display, and you could also ask any of us for recommendations, political, scholarly treatments of the history that we've covered. And finally, if you enjoyed tonight's event, please join us next semester. The date and time and speakers to be determined, but we're going to have another event in this Between Past and Future series on the subject of political realignment in American history and how it may or may not bear on the present. So with that, please join me in giving a warm round of applause to our panelists.